And thank you all for being here. My name is Jessica Lorai. I'm the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And the Interfaith Center is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to invite people from diverse secular, spiritual, and religious traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and friendship. We seek to unify people around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. So as I said, thank you to everyone for being here tonight. And we're going to be talking tonight about critical race theory, and specifically what is critical race theory. So I have two guests who are on our panel this evening. Our first guest is Dr. Denise Taliaferro Baszile, who holds a PhD from Louisiana State University. Her research focuses on understanding curriculum as racial gendered text with an emphasis on disrupting traditional modes of knowledge production, validation, and representation. Her scholarship draws on curriculum theory, critical race theory, and Black feminist theory, and seeks a fuller understanding rather than simply a legitimate understanding of the dynamic relationship between race, gender, and curriculum broadly conceived. Denise is also the Associate Dean of Diversity and Student Experience for the College of Education, Health, and Society at Miami University. And our second guest or speaker on the panel today is Prince Johnson, who is a member of the Interfaith Center's Board of Directors and a graduate student and lecturer for the Educational Leadership Program at Miami University. Prince is a Cincinnati native where he facilitates racial dialogue, community storytelling, youth activism, and contemplative yoga classes. So welcome to both of you. And I'm going to get right in here tonight and just start with the very first question, and you can both have a chance to answer it. And the question will be, what is critical race theory?
You want to go, Prince?
Oh, by all means, please go. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I guess the shortest answer I can give you is to say that it is, I would say, a movement as opposed to a theory, and people like to refer to it as a theory. I think it's a movement that is trying to answer the question of, in light of the fact that we have taken out the language of race out of a lot of our laws, and we, have gone through a whole period of advocating colorblindness, and yet we still have profound racial inequality and disparity, no matter what measure you look at, from education to health to healthcare to incarceration. So it's really trying to understand what is happening. Okay, it becomes a movement for the struggle for racial equity, but also a framework and concepts that help us talk about why the inequality and inequity continues to persist.
Okay. Prince, would you like to add anything to that?
Really not much to really say. I think Dr. Denise really hit it on the head there to really frame critical race theory indeed like as a movement, and some of the ways in which me personally that I like to work with critical race theory is that it helps me to kind of provide an analytical lens to make sense of racial occurrences that are always happening inside the classroom or even outside the classroom or in a broader society. So it really, at least for me, allows me to look at the ways in which racism, how it works in this society, how it functions, and also how it's very permanent, right, here within the United States, which is a very difficult pill to swallow. But it just forces you really to begin to face history pretty much. So to add on to Dr. Denise, it is definitely a movement. I think it's a movement as well to lead us into greater consciousness and an awareness about our relationships to each other and what are those things that inform these social relationships that we have as we navigate around in society. So, yeah.
Okay. And another question that I have that maybe some others do too is, where does critical race theory come from? I know currently that it's being discussed with regard in many states with regard to the education system. But from my understanding, it doesn't come from necessarily a background, or we're kind of laying it over the education system and looking at it from that perspective. But can you tell us why and how critical race theory was originally developed, and by whom?
Yes. So there are probably two answers to this. One for me is to say, if I were to identify what scholar I thought of is the very first sort of critical race theorist, I would point to W.B. Du Bois. Because every single sort of tenet, idea, or concept functioning in critical race theory, you can find it in Du Bois's work. But in terms of its current and most recent iteration, we can go back to the 80s, which critical race theorists would identify as a period of severe backlash after the civil rights, after some pretty important and significant wins in the civil rights movement. We were now confronting backlash, which is absolutely consistent with the way race happens in this country. We've had many moments in our history where we could decide differently, and yet we don't. So we can go all the way back to the moment after slavery and at the point of Reconstruction, where you had a multiracial coalition of abolitionists who were trying to reimagine our democracy, trying to reimagine it as a multiracial democracy. And then the powers that be, killed it. And so we see these periods over and over again. So in the 80s, under Ronald Reagan's leadership, we were confronting a backlash, a pullback on many of the civil rights wins, and a very pervasive narrative of welfare queens and drug lords and all kinds of things that we see often politicians using to leverage the vote in a particular way. And so at that time, a legal scholar, Derek Bell, along with a whole other group of students at Harvard University, he took an unapproved leave from Harvard to protest the fact that they would not hire a woman on the Harvard Law School faculty, a woman of color. And when he stood in that protest, the one class on race and law, he taught the one class on race and law that it wasn't going to be taught. The students were very upset about it, and they went back and forth with the university over this for a while, but then decided that they would hold their own class and invited in different legal scholars who were looking at race and had done work with critical legal studies, which really was a very strong critique of the traditional law, but through the lens of class. And a lot of the critical race scholars came out of that group because of the fact that they were trying to understand race in some of the same ways. And so that's its, most recent iteration, really grows out of the protest of these students to try to understand why this whole ideology of colorblindness just hides the actual workings of race as a form of power in our country. And so it comes out of law school. I do have a theory about why I think they're picking on education, though, because I do believe I think there's lots of disinformation going on, and when I say disinformation rather than misinformation would mean you're giving information that you don't really know is wrong. I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's purposeful disinformation, and not really an effort to find out, what critical race theory is. And, in the work that I do, and I know Prince does, and a lot of us do, is we argue the fact that we aren't doing a lot of history from multiple perspectives in our classrooms. We aren't bringing in African American history or indigenous history. We aren't, like, this is the fight we've been fighting. So it's ironic for them to be outlawing something that's actually barely happening in the schools at all. My theory, though, about why they're picking on education is because I feel like there have been some trigger points in the past couple of years that have brought us to this point. And one, I would say, is the 1619 Project that brings a whole alternative perspective on the institution of slavery and its role in the making of America. And I think people can have different perspectives on it, but that's the point. We should recognize that there will be different interpretations on it depending where you're located in that story. And so when we teach history, we should be teaching multiple perspectives on any one event. So that, to me, was the impetus, but also the uprisings in the summer of 2020 was a very multiracial coalition. And I think that really scared some people to see their children aligning with Black Lives Matter, and a recognition that the ways in which they think about race is very different than the way many people, many of our elders think about race. And so I think those were trigger points. And critical race theory, I guess, sounds scary. So what they're talking about, what they're trying to shut down in schools, though, it's not critical race theory per se, right? Critical race theory is a lot of sophisticated ideas that nobody would actually try to teach that framework in elementary school. But what you will do in elementary school is try to talk about race, try to talk about different people, and, democracy and equity and fairness are all things that we should be talking about. And you cannot deal with those things honestly without recognizing the way in which racial dynamics, the way in which our profound belief in racial hierarchy has shaped, shaped the country, shaped our institutions where we, produce and legitimize knowledge. All of that matters. And so what they're contesting under the name of critical race theory is anything to do with race. And to me, the only way you can even try to surveil or police that dynamic is with the expectations that students are going to tell on their teachers and professors, and which is that's just a terrible situation and really unnecessary. So it's unfortunate, I think, that people, we've had whole school districts outlawing critical race theory who don't even teach anything about race or other people's perspectives, that's already the problem we've been trying to solve. And, so this moment feels a little bit it feels a little bit like moving backwards. And the one other thing I want to say about this, because I feel like another part of this narrative is that people imagining critical race theory's purpose is putting people of color in control over white people, or doing, whatever, turning the tables, or however people want to imagine it. And that is not the vision. That's the wrong vision. The vision is to create a world where we have more justice, more equity, more peace for more people. And that is not just for people who have money, not just for people whose whiteness may accord them some level of power, not just, it's for everybody. And the truth is, this fight for it is a fight for a better America, a better world, where you don't have to worry about, crimes and robbery. And the more equity you create, the less we have to, worry about the kinds of things that keep us up at night.
Okay, you covered a whole bunch of stuff there, and I love it. And some of those things I do want to pick apart even a little bit more, but I want to back up just a little bit and talk about a couple things. Prince and I had a discussion a week or so ago, or a couple weeks ago, about race. And my question to him was, is race even real? And I'm putting race in quotes. And I'm going to turn that over to you, Prince, because I loved your take on that. And so let's ask that question. Is race real, or is it just something that's, been sort of fabricated based on appearances? What's your thought on that?
The easiest answer is to say it's not scientifically real, right? Race is a way of creating categories of people in order for one particular group to maintain its dominance over all others. So one of the things that I teach at Miami, we talk about these things called social constructs, right? And so just as human beings and as social mammals, we have to create collective agreements and make meanings together because we're relational beings, right? And so that's just fundamental just to our species. And so race, unfortunately, collapses into that kind of framework of thinking. So we use race as a way to order our human relationships. And it's unfortunate that race has been used as a means in order for one racial group to have dominance over all others. So, and I think that's where CRT would be really useful if America would open up itself to have a very robust debate around, what is exactly race, right? It is a social construct. Just because we make it real, it doesn't mean that there are social consequences that inform our lived experiences, right? But that's the power of us as a species, right? Is that we create our social realities, and we are also created by them. And so I think, especially when you hear right-wing reactionary talking points, they would say that, well, race isn't scientifically real. So then there's no room to try to examine about the ways in which a racial dictatorship exists here within the United States, because we can just chop it up and just say like, well, it's not real. But what CRT does is tries to show that it is a socially construct. It is a social construct, but it is a social reality, and these realities inform everyone. It even informs white identities or even other non-white identities. And so there just needs to be a more healthy, robust debate about one, where does race, really come from? That's another maybe topic for another time. And then also thinking about why do we continue to reinforce these ideas of race? Why do they continue to exist in this point in time in our society? So I hope that hope that made sense there. So that's my take.
Yeah, thank you. And then I know also that there are 5 basic tenets or principles of critical race theory. Could we go through those? And you don't have to go into great detail, but just to give us a little more idea of what does critical race theory say?
Yeah, so here are some of the tenets. See, I took this class before, so all right. One of them is that race is permanent. Race functions to order society, essentially. And I think if anyone were to do a good, robust historical examination about even the origins of white supremacy and how that was very essential to the founding of this country, they would see that race started during that time of the founding of this country, and it will continue on until forever, right? And because the permanence of race exists here, what we try to do in a lot of our work between Dr. Denise and myself, and even some of our viewers here, is that since we know that race is permanent here, we try to move from a racial dictatorship of one particular racial group into a multi-racial democracy, right? So there's that one. The second tenet is that the political category, the racial category of whiteness can be seen as a form of political property. That is to say that white identities has within it certain political interest. And I would like to make the argument that other non-white racial identities serve as political currencies for the political property of white identities, right? So I don't know if that made sense. That's something I've been really wrestling with the past couple of days. The third thing is CRT uses a lot of storytelling and lived experiences. So it's often said, especially how we kind of come to know how things are true through our schooling and through our formative education, is that, if you can't prove anything, then it can't be counted as like actual knowledge or something valid. Well, CRT argues is that people's lived experiences and their stories help to describe how this racial society actually works. So people's lived experiences of living as a racialized subject are very essential in order to describe how it works, how it functions, and how it exists, right? And then there's this thing called interest convergence, which is like another tenet of critical race theory, whereas the interest of non-white racial identities, their progress, whatever they consider to be something, whereas their like social progresses by non-white racial identities, or any kind of quote unquote victories, those victories and those progresses only exist because of the fact that it is aligned with the political interest of white identity, right? So if you were to look at the desegregation of schools, even though that was a huge win and it helped to usher in the Civil Rights Act, a lot of the desegregation of schools came about because it was Cold War politics, basically. The Soviet Union was trying to say, well, the United States is trying to tell the rest of the world how to be, and now look at how they treat their black citizens. They don't even treat them well, and it was an embarrassment to the rest of the world. And so the United States then had to lean into the demands of the civil rights era. And I think that opens up a huge discussion about ways in which non-white racial identities can start thinking more internationally, right? And as a term of political leverage. So interest convergence essentially means that the interest of white political groups are aligned with non-white political groups, right? And so, and that makes us also more susceptible to some of these backlashes that we see today. It's right, just like what Dr. Denise said. Critical race theory also critiques liberalism, right, which is like United States kind of like rules to live by, I guess you might want to say. The idea that you can make it here if you work hard. The idea that maximize individualism, your own self-effort as you navigate in this particular society. What CRT wants to say is to challenge this whole idea of meritocracy, of bootstrap ways of thinking, or not relying on the state or government handouts and things like that. Even though there are political groups from the far right, even centrist Democrats, right, or corporate Democrats who also are welfare kings and queens themselves. So CRT wants to critique the ways in which non-white racial identities actually navigate within the political economy in this society, right? And so we really want to always, a chin check, you might want to say, the ways in which these myths about success and climbing up the ladder of success. What are some of the racial barriers that exist there that to keep people from that kind of success? And the last part is intersectionality. We still hold fast to the idea that race is at our center of our analysis, but we like to think about race and its connection to class, which is one of my areas of interest, how race is connected with gender, or even how race is connected with the expansion of U.S. foreign policy all across the board. So intersectionality helps us to see, I don't want to say the bigger picture, because like in a lot of ways, when people say, oh, you're just talking about race, you're not seeing the bigger picture. What CRT says, no, we are seeing the bigger picture with race, right? So we're seeing it through multiple lenses, which is something that conservatives and Republicans, or even neoliberal kind of Democrats fail to do, right? We can go on another tangent on that. So those are some of the tenets of critical race theory. Luckily, I have some of my notes here. So that's how I see it. So hopefully that's clear.
Thank you. Denise, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think I think he's outlined them. I would say, since I've probably been involved or been becoming a critical race scholar for like 20 years now, at least. Yeah, probably longer than that, actually. Because I've been at Miami almost 20 years, and I was doing it just before coming to Miami. The one thing I would say, because it's faced critique from its inception, like from the beginning all along. And critical race scholars have been very attentive to evolving and not just speaking back to the criticism, but really leaning into it in a way that, when it's a constructive critique, we work with it and we grow. So when everybody was saying, but you just focusing on race, then there was intersectionality, when another thing people I think really like to criticize, or they call it out as pessimistic, is this whole idea of racial realism, which Prince was saying, understanding it as a permanent, understanding racism in particular is a permanent part of society as we currently know it. And I think every time we think we've nailed it, like we've moved beyond it, we find ourselves in a backlash, or we find ourselves with new iterations racism. And I think that's where the idea of its sort of permanence comes from, because it really looks like, if you could step back and look at it, like a roller coaster, right? There are ups and there are downs, but that roller coaster is always going in a circle. You will end up right where you began in some ways. And so, that's the way it feels consistently. And I think sometimes people don't really recognize or see, but I feel like, especially for those of us who live on the downside of these dynamics, or who have lived on the downside of these dynamics, you're waking up every day with questions like, how is it that we're at the top of every bad list and the bottom of every good list over and over again, after we've had civil rights, after we've had abolition and we've had civil rights, and, I think that's where this whole idea of permanence comes from. And I don't see it as pessimistic. What I see it, and what I'm grateful for, is clarity, right? Because something is wrong. You feel something is wrong. When you've had an interaction that makes you raise your eyebrow. And I say all the time, I feel very passionately that people of color don't, even when we speak up, we're not even telling you half of what it is we're walking in every day. And so, so when you get a theory or a set of theories or a set of ideas that help you explain what is happening, and then you go around and you test it, right? You go around and you, talk about it with other people. You go back and you look at the literature and the historical context, and it remains consistent. Then, for me, I appreciate the clarity, because then I know how to move in the world. And I know, I know what my struggle is about.
Okay. Thank you. This is one of the questions on my list here, is it, and you kind of are answering this, is it getting better? And I think in the chat, someone has asked the question also, did the civil rights movement fail?
I don't ever talk about movements failing. I believe in evolution and revolution, and every revolution comes because of an evolution, and evolution will eventually manifest a revolutionary moment. And so I don't believe in talking about movements as failing. They take us, though, only a little piece of the way, right? And then I always call it the long river of love and struggle. And it's many tributaries off of this, the main river line. And I think they do take us a piece of the way in an evolutionary way, right? We have got to change the way we relate to one another. We have got to change the built-in inequality in our institutions and in our systems. But we also have to remember that it's people who make the systems and the structures. It's people who, it couldn't exist, and it couldn't certainly continue to manifest if we didn't breathe life into it. And so, so to me, we have to be constantly working on that change. And it is, so I always see it as we're always moving, even when it seems like we're not, towards some sense of justice, but not in this way that it might happen in my lifetime. In this way that I think the bigger project is, how do we become more human humans being?
Okay, thank you. With regard to the criticisms of critical race theory, I also agree that it's an ongoing process of trying to educate folks. And I think that's one of the reasons that it can be frustrating that when we have this concept that is from an authentic experience, lived point of view of groups of people who are being marginalized and kind of kept down, if you will. And then we try to bring that to light. And like you said, with regard to this education bill, it kind of has gotten twisted around into something as if it's something completely different from what it actually is, and is turned into the very, almost a weapon against what is trying to be achieved in the first place. And you sort of alluded to that. So let's talk, if you don't mind, let's talk about what some of those criticisms of critical race theory are with regard to let's keep it into the current events realm of, lots of states have on their ballots for the election this year bills that have to do with what can and can't be taught in schools. And as we said, critical race theory has been brought into that picture. And so can you talk a little bit about that? How is it being portrayed as a sort of a example of why we shouldn't, or, there's an assumption that we're going to be talking about these really complex topics with grade school age children, and that wouldn't even be possible to talk about with young children because they wouldn't understand it. And so can you talk about how you think it's kind of being used?
Yes. So
Yes.
I want to be like really clear here, because they have taken the name critical race theory and applied it to something that it actually is not, or is not necessarily. But I do want to own the fact that I think critical race work has dramatically changed the way we think about race in this society. We, if we could talk about, before critical race theory, at least before critical race theory in this sort of mainstream way that people have been talking about it, is to say that, there was an idea that we were making radical progress, but what we were doing is, owning color blindness, rather than necessarily making that kind of radical progress. Making that sort of kind of radical, I'm sorry, I'm right now at the Critical Race Studies and Education Conference. So I think, so we need to kind of clear that up. And if you just read just the introduction to critical race theory, that gives you a nice tight little idea of what the critical race movement is about, Now, having said that, I do, again, it's radically changed the way we think about race, because, now we're understanding it is being able to operate without calling it out, right? Like, just think about Brown v. Board of Education. We take out, in this effort at desegregation, we sort of take out all the language about race, but it doesn't solve the problems, right? The problems are still happening, even though race isn't directly signified or specified in our laws. It's still signified in the way that we carry them out. And there's evidence of it all around us. And so I think that's really important piece right there. So what they're trying to do in education is they don't want any conversation that where this started was, we don't want to teach anything that will make white students feel uncomfortable or hurt white students' self-esteem. So first of all, I would say any teacher with any integrity doesn't want any student leaving their class feeling, you know, uh, you know, permanently in a state of guilt or shame or, you know, blamed for things that have happened in the past. But by the same token, the whole definition of learning is discomfort. And we don't learn until we're a little bit uncomfortable. That challenges us to learn and to grow. And that's whether we're talking about race or anything else, that's kind of learning 101. The other thing I would say is that, you know, not dealing with the hard history is not the answer. You know, taking divisive concepts out of education is not the answer. We live in a divisive society. And you have to know how to navigate that. We live in a diverse society that's never going to be less diverse than it is right now, only more. And so this thing that's going on right now, I would call it a campaign of ignorance, because that is what we're asking for, to keep our children ignorant of the history. Now, I think there's a way to do history. I would call out the way we do history now in telling facts, historical facts, I think is problematic. Because what I think we should do is own the fact that history is a craft and it requires interpretation, you know, based on some artifacts and, you know, widely accepted facts. But we have to honor the fact that there will always be different interpretations of it as people are positioned differently and as power is, you know, enacted differently. So I think we, you know, to say that not teaching these things is the better thing to do. Not teaching these things keeps us in the position that we're in with a certain, you know, power brokers continuing to stay in power and in that process denying equity, more equity, more peace, and more justice for more people. And I want to say, because this is important, people keep thinking this is about people of color, but this is about everybody at the end of the day. You know, it is absolutely about everybody. And it's about how do we make better choices so we're living in a better world. And you can't do that if you don't understand what's actually going on. And you don't understand that this current iteration is propaganda that just so happens to be on the tail of important elections. And this is historical too, using race to drive voting that's historic as well. If we can look back into the 80s and the last backlash, the whole rhetoric around welfare queens, Ronald Reagan's reference to welfare queens was very racialized and drove the election results as well. We can listen to some of these, they have all these great podcasts out right now about, you know, about school board debates and school dynamics. And you can see in these real live iterations, when you look at them through a CRT lens, you know, the power that's attached to whiteness, whether you want it to be or not, or whether you, I mean, you know, one great one to listen to is called Nice White Parents. And parents with the group of parents with every good intention to try to integrate New York public school. But in their presence and in their, you know, process of trying to fulfill their own self-interest, they're actually disadvantaging the kids who are already in the school. Not intentionally, but it's because they can move in a way that all the people in power listen. But when you've had the parents of color trying to do that same thing, they're basically ignored. So this is not about it's about the individual people, and it's not about the individual, it's about the system and the way the system is responding to it. And so it may not feel like you have power, but when you walk into a space, where people haven't been able to practice in that way, and haven't been able to move in that way, and you're just, trying to do right by your kids, but you're being able to leverage it in a way that these other parents cannot, or are ignored when they try. So I think that is, we're seeing a lot of it. Another good podcast to listen to is South Lake. And this is ground zero, basically, for the first CRT school board debate. And it's the school board is actually trying to do the right thing, but it's the parents in this very, upper class neighborhood in Texas who are completely resistant. And in their resistance, they completely ignore all the hurt that the students of color in the school district have been, it's students of color and LGBTQ students have been expressing. So I think those are if you want a real sort of deep contextualized example, those are two very good podcasts to listen to.
Okay, thank you. I think it's interesting too that when we're talking about what's divisive concepts, that the whole point of trying to teach the truth about the history of our country is to recognize that it's already divided. And so by just bringing that forward, there's an accusation that you're being divisive. It's just almost not, it's not comical, but it's very interesting. We'll use that word. And we do have a question in the chat that kind of, I think, is a relevant question I want to ask before we do run out of time. How would you advise educators to make the case for critical race theory with white parents who may push back? So as educators in school systems who do want to incorporate at least the concept of systemic racism into their classroom for, let's say, middle or high schoolers, or even at the college level. I mean, this comes all the way down to public universities. How can educators make a case for trying to tell the truth of the history of our country when they have these white parents pushing back?
Come on, Prince.
Okay, well, I'm a former educator myself. I taught second grade social studies and reading here in Cincinnati Public Schools, and I've also taught in the UK as well for about 4 years, teaching social studies and interreligious dialogue. That's a really interesting question because, in a nutshell, I think that we have to understand that this is going to be faced with great difficulty, and I think that educators as well need to accept that fact. Like, this is a real struggle that one is going to be engaging in. But what is really interesting about that question, because I think this is where educators can transform the classrooms and the schools as places for democratic learning as well, right? So in order to make the case, we've already kind of made the case, right? We've been making the case, but I think it's time for them to participate with their differences in mind. That's the first place that I tend to kind of go to. And I don't know what exactly does that look like. I've never really engaged in those kind of struggles before. But the whole reason why I became an educator was that it was a way in which to teach children to live within a democracy. And it's apparent that a lot of white parents, unfortunately, have not done so. And so there has to be some kind of collective kind of learning that can kind of take place between PTA, parents, and teachers to begin having this robust kind of conversation about how do we approach, and I'll give, white identities or Euro Americans that, like, how do we then approach teaching this history accurately, and just open that up as a question. And so I think that we have to transform all of these educative spaces, school boards, the classroom itself, PTA boards, and other spaces where education is really talked about, and start just framing that question. Well, how do we then go about approaching this safely? Because Dr. Denise is right. History is a skill, right? And so I think that I don't want to say that kind of puts that whole debate around teaching CRT on a level playing field, but at least it can begin like opening the dialogue a bit. So I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that even makes sense, but I just really think that we can also look to past examples of the ways in which schools and teachers themselves were at the forefront of a lot of these like radical or democratically radical questions. So that's my my two piece in there. But I think that it's we really are living in very interesting times, and I think that I just foresee that educative spaces can become incubators for teaching our children to a radical democracy. That's how I feel. So these parents as well have to be a part of it, and not just these kind of what we see on television. Euro-American parents are in line with a microphone in a school board meeting, voicing their opinions and things like that, right? We have to kind of tip the scale to be, how can we engage in much broader conversations around this? And so I don't know if that made sense, but whatever. Yeah.
It absolutely makes sense. I would also just say I'm a little old school about this. So, I was born in Detroit in '67. Sort of, I'm getting the sort of residual impacts from the Black Power, Black Studies, Black arts movement. And I know what my parents did for me and my siblings, and really what my grandparents did for all 27 grandchildren, was continue to put us in spaces where we were, where our education was expanded. So schooling did not hold our education hostage. Right? There are many places where we learned, because I think we also understood that school couldn't do what we needed it to do. It does have a function and a purpose in a democracy. It's to bring everybody together and hear out everybody's perspective, and work through our different perspectives and disagreements. I think those are extremely important skills. But I needed what you need as a Black child in this society, who's, whatever, only played with white dolls, or only heard fairy tales where all the people are white, only look at shampoo commercials where it's only white people. I mean, all these sort of ways in which whiteness is valued in a way that Blackness or non-whiteness is not. Is to understand what's happening, is to understand your own historical context, and to understand that you stand in the tradition of people who continue to fight against this racism in many forms. And so, I could come home with a story from school like Columbus discovered America, or Tarzan is the king of the jungle, and my parents or my grandparents or my aunts and uncles, somebody would sit me down and give me a whole other history. But at the end of that talk, they would always say, but you still better get an A, right? So at a very young age, I had to negotiate the knowledge. And depending on what space I was in, what I could say and what I couldn't say, and what little bit of challenge I could get away with in school. Could I raise the question, or was this not a safe place to raise the question, which to me is ridiculous. School should always be a place where you can raise a question, but it hasn't fundamentally functioned that way. And right now, I would say our schooling has been more focused on, economy, fitting us into the capitalist economy than it even has on democracy. It's not even, what do we say to children these days? Get a good education so you can get a good job. That not get a good education so you can think critically and be an active citizen and understand citizenship is more than just voting. All these other things we try to, it was supposed to be foundational, and it was supposed to be foundational to our democracy, but what it has been is foundational to our economy. And I'm not saying disregard the economy, but we've almost thrown democracy out the window. A lot of schools, especially with the standardized testing and the emphasis on reading and math, and no emphasis on civics or social studies or history for that matter. So I think, this is a real significant sort of moment for us. Our democracy grew out of a great revolution, and now it needs to be rethought in that same way. Like, we need a new set of values and rethink, the way we do education. Because for me, having those counter stories meant that there was nothing they could do in school to make me feel ashamed of myself. Things happen that could have made me feel that way if I didn't have those counter stories to pull on, and to understand myself in a different way, and to understand what school was for and what it was not for, and to understand that education is always, school is a very small part of a much bigger project and a much bigger journey towards self-understanding. And so I say, what are we doing outside of school, right? And if we just took African Americans, for instance, before desegregation, we are pretty much, no matter whether you had money, you didn't have money, or you had money, whether you were a doctor or a garbage collector, we lived in the same communities. Education was culturally relevant because your teacher also lived in the community, and the principal also lived in the community, right? We didn't have to fabricate these things because they were built into that context. And we also were educating in lots of different places, not just the school, but the church, the community organizations, political organizations, even my growing up, community centers, we had all kinds of things. But I think part of what's happened in this long journey after Brown v. Board, and I don't even know if we could say after desegregation, because we look around and most of our kids are in segregated, whether they're white or Black or Latinx or what have you. Most of them are going to school with other kids who look like them, majority. And so, I think we have to, we have to ask ourselves, is this, look at the things that keep us where we are, and then ask ourselves, what do we have to do differently? And, I challenge myself every day to choose love. Every time I don't curse somebody out, I choose love. Every time I don't, I choose love. And it's an everyday project, and sometimes I fail at it. Sometimes I don't choose it. But I have to get back up and try again to go have that conversation with somebody who I totally disagree with and can't get a word in edgewise. But, for the bigger, better, in the possibility of an after racial hierarchy or after racism is, I think, what keeps me going and what keeps me looking at the hard questions and asking the hard questions and trying to an extent to talk to the people. There are people who don't understand and want to understand, and I'm happy to have that conversation. There are people who absolutely know that what they're saying about critical race theory is not true, right? I feel like they absolutely know, and they are trying to get something else done. They are trying to keep power. And that's unfortunate, because I feel like sometimes they do it on the backs of all kinds of people, including white people not in power.
Mhm. Thank you. Prince and I also have talked, and I'm going to ask you this question, Prince, is what is the interfaith response to critical race theory, and what role do you see interfaith or even just faith communities playing in making a difference in the future?
Yeah, I think for many people of different faith traditions, or even people who are not of faith, you can use critical race theory and within your particular faith tradition or non-faith tradition. And I think that one of the things that I like about merging critical race theory with the idea of interfaith work, or even faith traditions and non-faith tradition, is that it's a form of a social contemplative practice. It's a way to be mindful of the ways that race as a social construct informs my own consciousness. We embody these things, right? So Peter McLaren, who used to teach at Miami back in the 80s during the times of this massive racial backlash, often said that human beings create social systems, and they are also created by them. And I think the by them part is what's really missing in how faith traditions and non-faith traditions talk about race, because we kind of tend to talk about race as if it's some form of abstraction that exists because of this bad behavior. There is really something about us as a species, right? In terms of what exists out there is actually, within us. So in my faith tradition, I practice traditional African contemplative practices. We have this proverb that says, when there's no enemy in the inside, the enemy on the outside can do us no harm, right? So that's how we tend to think about that. So many different faith traditions can begin thinking about the inside, right? Of thinking about the ways in which how they internalized their own identity, if they're Euro-American, and how they internalize their identity as a form of a political property, right? How does that affect my relationships, with others? So so we can think CRT, I think, is definitely, it can be applicable to interfaith work, and I'm always open to have robust conversations around that. But we can see it as a form of social contemplative practice, right? To see how do all these things outside of me show up within me, so that I can be a fully self-actualized human being, right? So and you just got to take a look, you have to take a look on the inside. But we just don't want to stay in the inside, though, right? Or it's not just about changing hearts and minds, it's also about changing the logics, the social structures, the processes of policies and bureaucracies, where we live and where we work and where we come to learn. Those are all in it. It is the real live matrix, right? So we have to really figure out, how do we come to not just come together, but come together in the name of consciousness to create something new, right? And that's what I feel like my people have always demonstrated, that as long as we've been here on this stolen land. Like we birthed a democracy even after centuries of picking cotton and accumulating wealth here, and in 1877 we were betrayed. And so I think that we have to come back to where do we really want to live in this particular point in time. And so I think CRT allows us to look back into the past and to the present, and as this transformative moment. And I think that will allow us to restructure ourselves. And so W.B. Du Bois has this amazing quote, and who I would call, like Dr. Denise, the first critical race theorist, or the classical critical race theorist. He says that the greatest problem in American democracy is that it hasn't been tried, So we have to try it. I mean, my people have wanted that. Like, if I'm not free, then nobody else is. And so it's just time for a deeper social contemplative work that needs to take place everywhere, all the time. So
yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate both of your input tonight, and we are a little over our time. Jason, it looks like you have a question. Would you like to ask it?
If we're over time, or maybe we can let people go, and because this one might be a little bit of a long one.
I'm okay with it. I mean, we're not being policed by anyone here, so.
Yeah, mine's a little complicated. So I find that
it's supposed to be over and they keep going.
The premise that race is socially constructed, absolutely agree. I'm a biologist. I understand what that means in terms of trying to define people and categorize them as a race. And you were great, Prince, showing the nuance that doesn't mean that people don't act like they're races, and then there's major differences in how they're treated, right? Because that's one response I get, people who claim color blindness, and then we don't talk about race at all. But the other problem I see is kind of on the other end, in that just because race as a category is socially constructed, that doesn't mean that there aren't biological associations to ancestry. And there are terrible uses of that, like white supremacists who use bullshit arguments about that stuff. But then there's very real ones in which people of color are systematically deprived of certain things. So the one thing that comes to mind is medicine, where historically Black people in America have been used either as guinea pigs or totally ignored, where they're not included in any medical testing in terms of usefulness, right? That it was basically tested on white men because that's who they tried to serve through their research. So those who would claim that there's not any biological ancestry have been sort of restricting that we can include people of color as a specific category in order to benefit them. So sorry, this just comes to mind that there's, for example, a discovery that a certain blood pressure medication was not effective in people who were generally race white, but was very effective in people who were under the race Black. And yet that got sort of pushed down, and they didn't get access to that, sort of based on worries about advertising to them or having drugs that were specific to race, because it builds on the idea that race does exist and there are biological implications. It's so freaking tricky, but it's another way that people of color are totally screwed. And so I wondered if you could talk about the nuance behind that, because there's so many facets of it between that and color blindness and white supremacy and all this stuff. It's so complicated. Thanks, and sorry for the long question.
No, can I respond to that? Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can I respond, Prince, before I have to check? They have kicked me out, and I'm in the street right now. But I want to say something about this, because I agree with you. Like, when we say there are no, like, race is not a biological concept. I think race is something that we've pinned on biology, though. And I do think that
to me, of course, we have biological differences. I don't, even if it's one itty bitty tiny molecule makes a difference, it's a difference. And I think our challenge is the fact that why do we have to understand the differences in terms of hierarchy, rather than why are they vertical rather than just horizontal differences? And I think that's the challenge that we're confronting, because there are so many things, I think, in the sort of medical sphere and in the biology that do make that are indicating differences among different groups of people. And I agree, we do overlook them, or we sort of don't talk about them or submerge them, because they make this racist social construction argument difficult to make, which is, also not good. And so I hear you on that. I don't know what the answer is to that, because it is almost a double oppression in a certain sense. But that's too why I always say there's the hard science, there's a social science, but there is a whole discursive network that undergirds the oppressive material conditions that we face. And, we have to lean into that in terms of these real conversations about what's actually going on. And rather than simply saying race is not biological or race is just social construction, without really digging into what that means and, in what way that has moved the conversation forward and in what ways it leaves the conversation stuck.
Yeah, to echo off Dr. Denise, like, we can think about these differences, but not in terms of like the racial logics that are underneath it, but just in terms of thinking about how is it that, what are some of these biological things that kind of cause these kind of differences, and things like that. And I just really had to second her on that. I mean, so there's even examples where they found that for a lot of us who are in here who are Euro-Americans, that they've discovered that some of the earliest ancestors that were there also were just as dark as I was, right? But living in Europe, Cheddar Man is a really good example of that, right? So there are so that kind of collapses the whole race argument there as well. But that for me really opens up a larger conversation about the horizontal plane, about a lot of different things. And that's the thing that I really kind of keep in mind. But I think the thing that keeps us from thinking about having a horizontal plane of our biological differences instead of thinking about it in terms of racial hierarchy is that there isn't a lot of conversations between different disciplines within universities. And I think that's a real problem, at least for me. There has to be more of these robust kind of conversations, because it is a problem if those of us who are CRT theorists or whatever, who would definitely, or not even CRT theorists, but people who maybe they don't want to bring up the very issue that you just raised because of the fact of how it would sound. Well, that to me is what kind of helps to promote racial logics to begin with. So we have to be epistemically courageous, right? Or we have to be really courageous about how to approach these things safely. And so my biggest dream is to see hard sciences and social sciences begin to start working together and begin to have a great dialogue, instead of having one department's over here, the other this school of disciplines over there. And if we're trying to teach everyone in any university to live in a democracy, then why aren't universities within themselves learning democratically amongst each other? You know what I mean? So that's how I feel. That's just my only addendum to Dr. Denise.
That was great, and I agree totally, especially with the epistemic courageousness. And one of the things I think of relating to that is, on the white supremacist side, they're constantly trying to push racist science. You know, there's differences in IQ, which biologically we haven't seen that outside of social conditions that induce that. But let's say there were. Who cares? That doesn't give you the right to subjugate another group of humans, right? And yet we can't tackle that, because if it were to be true, it would be so hard to handle, even though the humanity behind it is quite obvious. Treat people fairly and reasonably, and also people to understand averages and how statistics work, how the difference between two random people is larger than the difference between the average person of any given race and the average person of any other given race. So I guess it takes that, but yeah, not everybody's ready for that, but I think we need to go there. Thank you.
Hey, I'm ready for it. So you can hit my line anytime. So yeah, I'm ready for it. Yeah, I appreciate you. That's a great question.
Great answers. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Again, thank you so much, Prince, and thank you, Denise. Thank you for everyone for being here, for being willing to listen and learn. And these are the exact kinds of conversations that I hope you'll promote and have them with your families and friends. And I hope that we all choose change, you know? So thanks again, and everyone have a wonderful night.
Thanks so much for having me. This is a great discussion. Hope to see you all again. Thanks.